Allegedly, during the most productive period of his life as an artist, Vincent van Gogh walked into a wheatfield in a small village of Auvers-sur-Oise and mysteriously somehow ended up with a gunshot wound to the stomach. He was badly wounded, but he was still breathing. Incredibly, he managed to get up on his feet and slowly walk back to the inn where he was staying, right here at Auberge Ravoux, and pass away 30 hours later. Most people believe that Vincent shot himself in the Wheatfield, but not everyone agreed with this explanation, and even the evidence and witness accounts often contradict each other.
We took all the evidence to some of the top forensic experts in the country, and they told us he couldn't have shot himself.
Strangely, the pistol that shot Vincent was never confirmed, and some of Vincent's belongings reportedly disappeared, and allegedly an art historian named John Rewald visited Auvers-sur-Oise and heard from the villagers that Vincent had not shot himself at all, leading to many theories and mysteries about what actually happened. But what we do know for sure was that his last 70 days in the village was also one of the most productive periods of his life as an artist, and he seems to be more motivated to work than ever before.
He was in Auvers for about 70 days, and during those 70 days, he made 70 paintings. So he made a painting a day. So it was a particularly productive and important part of his life. There are many places around the town of Auvers where he painted, the town hall, the church, the Wheatfields, and so you can go look at all those places.
In Auvers-sur-Oise, Vincent was staying at Auberge Ravoux, a guest house owned by Arthur Ravoux. Arthur was also the innkeeper. He's one of the first person who saw Vincent after Vincent returned wounded, and the one who went out trying to look for medical help. During Vincent's last 70 days in the village, Vincent would often take his lunch and dinner at the Ravoux Inn, and he even painted portraits of Arthur's young daughter, Adeline Ravoux. Adeline was only about 13 years old at the time, but many decades later, in her old age, Adeline would write down her memories of what happened in the form of a letter, because more than 60 years after Vincent passed away, Adeline was the last living person who had met Vincent in Auvers-sur-Oise, and in her own words, she was the last surviving witness to his final days. She wrote that Vincent was a man of good build, with one shoulder slightly leaning to the side of his wounded ear. She described him as a person with a gentle and calm manner, and when people spoke to him, he usually answered with a pleasant smile. To Adeline, there was never any signs that Vincent was falling apart. She emphasized that Vincent had never drank any alcohol during his time in the village, and that when she learned that Vincent had once been in a mental asylum, she was rather surprised, because in Auvers-sur-Oise, the man she remembered was quiet, polite, and well-respected. Her statements were quite different from what was usually thought of Vincent, where he was believed to be quite difficult to work with. Years earlier, Vincent had been especially close to his younger brother Theo, and in 1886, the two of them had once lived together in Paris.
He spent his whole life wanting to live with his brother Theo, and they lived together for 2 years. There were moments of camaraderie, but it was also very difficult. Van Gogh was extremely difficult to live with, and Theo was suffering from medical problems, and Van Gogh knew that he was making his brother's life difficult, and he knew that it was impeding his brother's recovery. And so one day, in this act of enormous generosity, he just leaves Paris, leaves the apartment they shared together, and moves back into his incredibly lonely existence in Arles in the south of France.
After Vincent moved to the south of France, he once stayed together with another artist named Paul Gauguin, but the relationship quickly turned bad, and apparently one evening, Vincent had a mental breakdown and injured his own left ear without remembering what actually happened. It was a terrifying experience. Frightened of what's happening to his own mind, Vincent then admitted himself into a mental asylum. However, it would be wrong to say that Vincent was a madman. His letters to his brother show that he was deeply intelligent, thoughtful, and able to work with incredible focus.
So this idea that he was a mad painter, it's incorrect, let me say that. And he may have worked quickly, but he worked very deliberately. He would spend the night before a painting, typically, in bed, thinking, imagining what the painting would be like. It's really crucial to understand that these incredibly thoughtful paintings, these paintings where every single color calculation, thousands of color calculations, and thousands of decisions about how to apply the paint to the canvas, about every brushstroke. This didn't come out of madness. This came out of incredible thought.
One possible explanation for Vincent's strange periods of confusion was due to lead poisoning. This theory comes from the art materials that he used every day. At the time, many 19th century paints contained toxic lead-based colors. Vincent had a habit of sharpening his brush by licking and ingesting paint, and he was known to work intensely, sometimes carelessly, with paint materials. During his time at the mental asylum, medical records even describe Vincent in a state of confusion and had poisoned himself by swallowing paint or drinking paraffin. Lead poisoning can affect the body and the brain. Over time, it can damage the nervous system and cause stomach pain, weakness, confusions, seizures, and even hallucinations. These medical symptoms seem to overlap with Vincent's condition. In the letters written by Vincent, he also described incidents where he had fainted with no apparent reason and with no memories of what actually happened. On top of that, Vincent often complained about stomach problems, poor digestions, fever, and exhaustion that left him confused or unable to work. When Vincent went to the hospital, his condition was described as acute mania with delirium and might have suffered from a form of epilepsy accompanied by hallucinations. Sadly, at the time, these medical symptoms were still poorly understood. Psychiatry was still at its early stage, and doctors did not have the knowledge, medication, and support system that we have today. However, after spending a year in a mental asylum, Vincent seemed to have recovered. Then, with his doctor's approval, he finally left the asylum and moved to the countryside village of Auvers-sur-Oise.
The problem is, of course, that being in a hospital and having those crises changes him too. He was battling with the fact that he had to live in an asylum with many patients he couldn't speak to. So you see that in the periods that you could say that he's still healthy, it's quite clear that we have here a struggling person who doesn't know how to face the fact that he thinks that his illness will come back all the time.
Now, knowing this medical history, there are real reasons to believe why Vincent may have chosen to take his own life. However, Vincent was also deeply religious. He was the son of a pastor, and as a young man, he once tried to become a lay preacher. In many of his letters, Vincent wrote deeply about God. He spoke about service, faith, duty, and the importance of living with purpose. Yet, over time, this side of Vincent was often overlooked. The public seemed to prefer the idea of Vincent as the mad artist and the suffering genius, and in a strange way, this self-destructive story of his life became inseparable from the fascination of his art that had even made his work even more valuable.
The most outrageous aspects of his life story become more famous. They also helped make him famous. So you have an art that has a very deep appeal to everyone, and then you have an art market which has certain stars. And the mythology about Vincent certainly helps make him one of those high-priced painters.
On the 15th of May, 1990, one of Vincent's paintings from his final months, Portrait of Dr. Paul Gachet, was sold at an auction for a record-breaking price. Paul Gachet had been Vincent's doctor in Auvers-sur-Oise and had tried to save Vincent after Vincent returned wounded. And this portrait of Dr. Gachet became the most expensive painting ever sold at the time.
$20 million, $21 million, $22 million, $22 million, $25 million, $69 million, $70 million, $71 million, at $75 million.
Then, in 1965, roughly 70 years after Vincent passed away, a pistol was reportedly discovered by a farmer in a field of Auvers-sur-Oise. In 2019, this rusted revolver was sold at an auction in Paris as the most famous weapon in the history of art. But ironically, there was no definitive evidence linking the pistol to Vincent van Gogh. Even the strongest arguments were circumstantial. Its age, location, and the size of his bullet might possibly match the injuries seen on Vincent. However, Even these statements raise many questions, because the bullet was never recovered from Vincent's body, and even the pistol and the location where it happened was never confirmed. According to the letter written by Adeline Ravoux, after Vincent returned wounded, the village policeman arrived briefly and asked Vincent whether he had tried to take his own life. But Vincent did not give a full explanation. Instead, he replied that what he chose to do was his own business and insisted that no one else should be accused. Yet at the time, no one really asked about the missing pistol. There was no evidence that Vincent ever owned a revolver, and the location where the shot was fired remains unconfirmed. Reportedly, on the day he was shot, Vincent was painting outdoors. So for a long time, people imagined that Vincent had been painting in the Wheatfields, and that Wheatfield with crows was his final work. However, Vincent never gave any details on where he went or what transpired, and the supposed Wheatfield was quite far from Auberge Ravoux, possibly close to a kilometer away. Then, decades later, modern research had even complicated this idea. Technical studies had shown that the tree roots is more likely to be Vincent's last work, and the place where he made this painting was much closer to the Auberge Ravoux. And to complicate things even further, there are many stories that contradict each other. Decades after Vincent's passing, a woman known as Madame Liebers gave an interview to a biographer named Mark Traubel. She said that the Wheatfield story was incorrect. And according to her father, Vincent had left the Ravoux Inn and walked in the direction of Chaponval, a small hamlet west of Auvers-sur-Oise. Then at Rue Boucher, he entered a farmyard and went behind a pile of dung heap where a gunshot was heard. If this statement were true, it would be a problem for the traditional story, because Chaponval and the Wheatfields were in different directions. Then there was also a problem with the wound description. It was reported that the injury was small, just below Vincent's ribs, about the size of a large pea. The bullet also seemed to have been shot from an unusual angle, as if the gun had been held too low and pointed downward. So, if Vincent was really trying to take his own life, why would he aim for the stomach rather than the more fatal part of the body?
As we were looking into it, we took all the evidence to some of the top forensic experts in the country, and they told us he couldn't have shot himself. That if given the trajectory of the bullet wound, very few people shoot themselves that way. And it's extremely difficult to hold the gun. It's almost a gymnastic event with your left hand, and even more difficult with your right hand, and he was right-handed.
And then there was another version of this story, one that pointed in a completely different direction.
We found an account from one of the great art historians of the 20th century, a man named John Rewald, who was studying at the Sorbonne in the 1930s. And it made sense for him to go to Auvers because Van Gogh lived there. And what he heard and told lots of people, which was that the villagers of Auvers in the 1930s told him that Van Gogh had not shot himself, that in fact he was shot by two boys.
The boys at the center of this theory were René Secrétan and his brother Gaston. They came from a wealthy family of pharmacists and were spending their summer holidays in Auvers-sur-Oise. Researchers seem to have verified this connection and even pointed to a mysterious drawing that was found among Vincent's belongings, showing a young boy in a large hat that was very likely to be 16-year-old René, dressed in a cowboy costume. This is because in 1890, cowboys were very popular in France. A year earlier, an American performer named William Frederick Cody, better known as Buffalo Bill, had brought his famous Wild West show to Paris. It became a sensation all over the country, with cowboys, horses, sharpshooters, and stage battles. According to later accounts, René Secrétan at the time was a huge fan of the show.
And then René Secrétan bought a Buffalo Bill costume, and he spent the whole summer wearing this Buffalo Bill costume and shooting birds and squirrels. They also bullied Van Gogh. They put salt in his coffee. They put a snake in his paint box. They mistreated Van Gogh like this everywhere he went.
Decades after Vincent's passing, René Secrétan, near the end of his life, gave an interview in 1956. He admitted that he had met Vincent in Auvers-sur-Oise and was carrying a pistol at the time. He described the weapon as an .380 caliber pistol that was falling apart and only worked erratically. However, René never mentioned the model of the pistol, or the rusted revolver found in Auvers-sur-Oise was a 7mm Rue Boucher revolver. So, technically, these calibers do not match, and René's pistol was not the same weapon that was later found in the field. But both weapons share a similar description, as an old unstable pistol, and any of them could have been the one that injured Vincent van Gogh.
I would say this gun is prone to accidents, and there are more accidents with small guns than there are with large guns. It's easy to be distracted, to point it in the wrong way, and in this instance we also have the folding trigger. So the trigger would fold away, so it could be put into a holster or away inside a pocket, but you'll notice that it has no trigger guard. So it is perfectly possible to hit this against something and maybe set it off in that way. If you get it wrong, perhaps you set it off by accident.
According to this theory, René Secrétan or his brother Gaston might have accidentally shot Vincent as a result of a prank. Then, when Vincent returned wounded, he made it seem like he had shot himself, so that the young boys would not be blamed. They may have kept quiet out of fear, while Vincent may have chosen to protect them. However, there was also another unusual detail. Allegedly, in an interview, Adeline Ravoux had said that she believed Vincent was trying to take his own life. But the pistol that was used actually belonged to her father, Auberge Ravoux, and that he had lent it to Vincent to scare off crows.
An account from Adeline Ravoux, she thought her father, Gustave Ravoux, had given Vincent a gun to scare away crows. It doesn't make any sense. In July, there were no crows in Auvers, and Van Gogh was a bird lover. So the idea that he would need to scare away birds is not logical. It turns out her father did not give the gun to Vincent. He gave it to two boys, Gaston and René Secrétan.
In the interview given by René Secrétan, he confessed that he had gotten his pistol from Auberge Ravoux, but argued that Vincent had stolen the weapon from him, and insisted that he had left the village where Vincent was shot. So, if the pistol really came from Auberge Ravoux, it would add another layer of mystery to the entire story, because if Auberge had never given the weapon to the young boys, Vincent may never have been injured at all. So, could it be that Auberge knew the boys had shot Vincent, but he felt partly responsible for what actually happened, so he decided to help Vincent cover up the truth? Or, in another possibility, could it be that the gunshot was just an accident while Vincent was handling the pistol? Perhaps Vincent never intended to take his own life, but once he was wounded, he no longer fought against it and allowed everyone to believe that it was his own decision. However, this theory wasn't universally accepted. In a letter, Adeline Ravoux gave another possible explanation. According to her, Vincent's younger brother Theo had told her father that Vincent's final letter showed that he was worried about money and afraid of becoming a financial burden. This could be a motive for Vincent to take his own life, but in Adeline's own words, she also noticed something strange. When Vincent's letters were later released to the public, this motive was not clearly visible in Vincent's last letters. So she wondered whether some of the writings or part of the letters had been left out entirely. However, at the same time, Adeline's account also came with its own problems. First, she wrote it decades after the event, and this part of the story was not something she witnessed herself, but a retelling of what she heard from her father. Later researchers had also questioned Adeline's statement, wondering whether certain details were added after Vincent's passing to promote the Auberge Ravoux.
She gave 3 different accounts, each one of them successively more thorough and with additional details, so it cast doubt on the integrity of Adeline Ravoux.
It's difficult to know which version of the story was entirely true. Even researchers were completely divided.
There was no question about it that he shot himself. And the story of boys shooting him is simply not true. He's become such an important person that these stories will be added to his life, although they might not be true.
Vincent talked about it with some frequency, and he said that he would never do it, that it was an act of a coward. My feeling is one of your jobs as a writer is to accept the fact that new evidence will emerge. It's hard to accept a reversal of a story this important, but if the scientific evidence is there, it seems incumbent upon us to accept that.
The official statement from the Van Gogh Museum still described that Vincent shot himself in a Wheatfield, but even the exact location where it happened was never firmly established. Yet, in 1956, a movie about Vincent van Gogh helped make the idea famous worldwide, and over time, the Wheatfield became the image everyone remembered. But perhaps the evidence itself was never quite that simple.